All right, Weinberger, thank you so much for joining the podcast. How's it going, man? It's been a while.
It has been a while. It has been a while. Things are going good. Things are, good as they can be for February 2021.
Yeah, I
So,
hear you. I hear you. Are you still in the city?
yeah, no, my girlfriend and I, we actually just moved into a new place in Astoria that was right across the hall.
Oh,
Yeah, well, two bed, two bath. We stole the washer dryer from the last place. Not stole, the landlord gave us money. He had taken it because an old tenant left it there. So now we're all settled.
wow,
Yeah,
congrats.
it's good.
That's pretty cool. They just left it there? Like, who
It,
does that?
an old tenant left it there. They said years ago, and so when we moved next door, I saw there was like washer dryer hookup, and I was like, "Hey, like, can we take that?" And he was like, "Yeah, I don't care." And I was like,
Wow.
"Cool, can I have a hand cart to move it?" He was like, "Yeah, sure, I don't care." And I was like, "You're the best."
Man, wow, just winning.
Yeah, winning
All
everywhere.
right. So the topic of today is Judaism. I thought before we like delve into, more in the weeds in regards to the history and everything, we could start off by you just telling the audience, your story, your experience in Judaism, what it means to you, what the culture means, and everything.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I was born into a Jewish family. I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, and my parents growing up weren't that particularly religious until it was time for us to go to school, right? And so um, the local public school wasn't great. So they're like, oh, we'll send you to Jewish day school because why not? And then, my sister started coming home and being like, hey, like, why don't we keep Shabbat? And like, why don't we keep kosher? And why don't we do all these things that I'm learning about? And so my parents made the decision that like, if we're gonna talk the talk, we might as well walk the walk, right? Like if we're gonna send them to this school, we might as well start living, I guess, more Jewishly, you would say. And that kind of set us off on like a little, lifetime of Jewish values. And like, listen, I was in Jewish day school until I graduated high school. And it was certainly a bubble. Like I had no non-Jewish friends before I got to college. But part of that really informed just like my moral compass and just like certain things that, I gravitated towards, that are in Judaism, but aren't necessarily inherent to Judaism. But, I grew up with the lens of Judaism, viewing everything, and it's really shaped me who I am as a person in that sense. So.
Nice, nice. And I think, from like the books I've read and like, what I know, like Judaism fascinates me. It was the first successful monotheistic faith in human civilization. And like when you look at, some of the reasons as to why that is, it seems like well, first off, like when the population originally was around, and I believe is the correct term Yeshua or
Yosh,
Yahweh.
yeah, Yehoshua?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, there was like, people that they had bouts with who, were more in the polytheistic realm, and there were these battles, and then they kind of won those, and people were like, oh, like maybe we should take this a bit more seriously. And like you kind of just see how that's kind of spiraled to where we are today. And monotheism in general is more prominent in today's society, but it's more so Christianity and Islam, while with Judaism, it's kind of funny because it's like those two other monotheistic faiths. It's kind of like a club that they're looking to branch out and broaden, while Judaism is more like, we're gonna keep to ourselves. We're not trying to to broaden out and go in that particular direction. Why do you think that is?
Well, a couple of things about that. One, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all believe in the same God, right? Like, you know, there was like Abraham spoke to God, and then Moses, same God, and then Jesus was just he was coming down, and he was like, "Hey, this is what God told me. It's like the new teaching, same God, new teaching." And then Muhammad was like, same thing. It's like Allah, same God, new teaching though. And Judaism, being the OGs that we are, we're like, okay, like you can do that. We're not going to do that. Like whatever, you do your thing. We don't believe that, and or like the updated version, I guess you would say. And part of that, I guess, stems from the fact that like in Judaism, like we don't prophesize. Like you're actually not allowed. You're not allowed to like make people convert and like tell them that like, hey, you're doing this wrong. Like you need to be a Jew. Like just it's just inherently not allowed in the religion. That's not to say that we don't, if you want to do that, we're not going to say no. Like it's schooling. It's a lot of like learning and understanding what everything means. And today anyway, there's like a lot of different ways to go about it. But um, why it's one of the why like the first successful monotheistic religion, I guess it stems from the fact that like before there was like the idea of God created the universe and you're living in it. And like that's welcome to you're here. He doesn't care about you. He created it. He doesn't care what you're doing because you're small potatoes. With Judaism, it kind of created this idea that um, a personalized God is that God created everything and he has a specific way in which sorry,
Yeah.
God had specific way that God would like you to live your life. So that kind of created this ethical framework, if you will. And I think that was easier to grasp and like allowed to be more understanding than just like, oh, like, well, it was God's will and like that sucks, blah, blah, blah. And it's like nothing I can really do about it. I have no like control over my life because it's like God's will, blah, blah, blah. Where now this was like, oh, like, well, if I follow this specific path, like good things will happen. And if bad things happen, like, there's an explanation for that because, God's will, but like maybe if I do this or like, I guess it kind of offered a pathway forward, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I think, you know, when like you look at polytheism and like not to like generalize because I think like for instance like Hinduism is technically considered polytheism and I wouldn't really necessarily put it into this bucket, but like the other types of polytheistic faiths that were prominent in that time frame, there definitely wasn't as much of a outlook of, I guess, order and stability to that extent that you see within Judaism and then the faiths uh after that. And I think it depends on the individual. You can kind of look at that as a good or a bad thing, right? Like because some people can make the argument that it kind of instilled a mechanism of control and instilling fear almost within people to a certain extent. To your knowledge, so like when it comes to what happens when we die, like what were like the teachings that you had instilled with you in Judaism?
Actually, Judaism is super vague about what happens to us when we die. There's like certain like terms and ideas, like there is like the Garden of Eden, and there's this term, Shemaim, which is like the skies or the heavens, and then there's this idea of Gehinnom, which is like hell, I guess, right? It was like a valley where there was a lot of like child pagan sacrifice. I'm like, oh, that's probably what hell would be like or whatever. And then there's like the Shoel, which is like oblivion and not purgatory. It's just it's referred to kind of just as like a pit under the earth. And it's just like there's no consciousness or anything. It's like kind of just referred to as like oblivion. And then the biggest thing in my Jewish education was always this idea of olam haba, like the world to come. And that also is different. Is that like, okay, is that after resurrection? Is that after like when do we get to that part? And so there is, I guess, like, you can piece together an order, if you will, but for the most part, like Judaism emphasizes um, life more than what happens after we die. Like we don't really focus as much on um, what happens then because we have a life to live and like that's the important thing.
Right. Like, is it fair to say that most of the texts primarily focus on like the nation first and foremost, and like kind of like you could almost interpret some of it as you know a metaphor in regards to the nation being a living, breathing organism, and like just the things that need to be done, and like in order to like make God happy to then ensure that the nation maintains its stability and prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately Judaism is a lifestyle religion, right? Like keeping kosher, like what you can and cannot eat, you know, Shabbos, like you can and cannot do work, like days you have to rest, you can't do work. And like, as I mean, that's like that's in like the Old Testament, but like as you even get further down, it gets nitty gritty. It's into being like, rules around, if livestock goes missing, like what's your responsibility to return it to its owner? Or like when you're harvesting your field, you have to leave the corners. You're not, so if you're in the Old Testament, it says like if you're harvesting your field and you drop pieces of wheat, you can't pick them up, and you don't harvest the corners because that's for the poor. The poor will come and take that as like a tithe almost, to make sure that like the community is taken care of. Like there's this big idea that okay, for in Judaism, like this idea of tzedakah, which is like people think charity, but the root word is tzedek, which means justice, right? So when you give, like people give some money for tzedakah, it's like don't give some money for charity. You're giving it for justice because it's the right thing to do, because people need help and you need to help them.
Right.
So like a lot of Judaism revolves around kind of that tenet, where it's like you are it's like about compassion and love, and like you have to help your fellow man. Like you can't be indifferent is another one. Like you can't just walk around and being like, oh well, that doesn't concern me, so like I can ignore that. It's like, no, like you have to do the right thing.
Right. And going back to the topic of death and like the level of ambiguity in regards to that, from what I read, like so I read this one book called Heaven and Hell, which was amazing. I really liked it. And like they talk about the shoal, and they talk about um philosophers like Socrates and Plato, and how there just was always this fascination in regards to what exactly happens when you die, and like the theories in regards to the soul, and like it being an entity that lives on like once like your body vessel dies. And but then some people kind of compare it to like your hand and it being an extension of your body, and like once your body dies, so does that, and that like you cease to exist. And it seems like from like what I've read, like the Shul and like Judaism in general, like when it first came to be, there was more of this belief that once you died, you go to this realm like the Shul, where you're basically in a deep sleep forever, basically. And like that's that. Pretty simple. And then it seems like as time progressed, there started to be interpretations of things that were written that were more in regards to present day and in regards to people living now. And it was then reinterpreted as what happens after you die. And then you start to see the manifestation of apocalyptic Jews during the times in which uh, Christ was around. What are your thoughts on that? And what are your thoughts on just, you know, which avenue is more uh of like leading towards the truth?
Well, truth, loaded question, buddy. um, well, I think there's like, if I took basically everything I know about, what Judaism says about the afterlife, because there is a resurrection in Judaism, right? So if I were to piece together, it's like when you first pass away, you're in the Shoel, you're in this deep sleep, you're not really conscious, and you're kind of just waiting around for like the resurrection. So you come back, right? And that is where I guess God would quote unquote judge you, and that's whether or not you go to, the Garden of Eden, or this other Gene Honam. Sorry, I forget the exact pronunciation. Um, which is like hell. But and like like that would be, I guess, quote unquote, the order of things. Now, what's interesting is after resurrection, that's really what people refer to as Olam Haba, like the world to come. So I guess like post apocalypto. Um, but what is interesting is that it says everyone has a place in the world to come, right? Which means not just Jews, non-Jews, like everyone has a place in the world to come. And most people are going to go to the Garden of Eden. Like you have to be like a pretty bad mamma jamma to like end up in hell. Like, you know what I mean? Because and I think part of that has to do with the fact that like Judaism places much more a bigger emphasis on actions than words, right? Like you like you know to know what all the right things are but to do none of them, like what's the point in that? But if you don't know what the right things are but you just do them anyway, like that's like what's important. That's ultimately what is important in Judaism. And there's this book called Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of Our Fathers, which has some things in it that are a little like, I don't know about that. But keep in mind, it's like middle-aged rabbis of Middle Ages. But some of the things like really stand out. And one of my favorite ones talks about a tree with few roots but many branches. To what can they be compared? The winds of the world blow against them and they topple over. And but what about a tree with many roots and few branches? All the winds of the world blow against them, and they stand strong. And like the roots is their actions, right? It's the understanding and actions of what's the right thing to do, versus like the branches are more like the study and knowledge parts. If that
Right.
makes sense.
No, yeah, absolutely. And like, so there's two things that come to mind when you're talking about that. First thing, I feel like especially in the Old Testament, there's lots of stories that are basically archetypes in regards to just, you know, like lessons on how to live and how to behave that I think a lot of times we kind of don't we kind of look past what the story is trying to tell us. Like a perfect example, I think, is like with Cain and Abel, and how it's like Abel was great, like his sacrifices for God were always great, and like God like was always happy with him. Cain, it's like I don't like this, I don't like your sacrifices, blah blah blah. And like Cain would for that like always have this disdain for his brother, killed him, and forever was cursed. And we just look at that as face value and be like, oh, don't be a schmuck. And but
Don't
like
be
I think,
jealous. Yeah.
yeah, don't be jealous. But I think that it goes a little bit deeper. Like it's kind of the story of humanity and how you have to kind of try and avert your just inner uh insecurities, your prone to just acting out, and being jealous and wanting what someone else wants, instead of looking within and trying to figure out what it is that you can do. And like I think that when you look at those archetypes, when you look at that those texts and what they teach, and like how, like specifically in Judaism, there's that culture of like really absorbing all of those things. I don't think that, like, when you look at a lot of the statistics in our society today, it's not that surprising that, like, for instance, when you look at the amount of people who have won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think that it's like a crazy number. Like I think like 25 or like maybe even more of them have been of Jewish heritage. When like you look at a lot of success rates, and like you see that like a lot of the times like a large, even though like Jewish people don't account for a good amount of the population, like generally they uh do account for those particular categories. And I don't think that's by mistake. I think that that's because of like an amount of grit and determination that's been instilled within a group of people throughout time, embedded by the stories and the things that have been fed from generation to generation, and has just continually been uh, very consistent. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Um, well, you know, they say the Jews are the people of the book, right? Because it's like studying and knowledge is definitely something that's sought out. Like, you know, I mean, even my own life, like the only reason I went to Jewish day school is because my parents thought I'd get a better education there. They weren't necessarily at the time concerned with like my Jewish education. They were just like, oh no, like he'll get a better just general education there, right? Um, you know, this idea that, through Judaism that um, we are, I don't want to say more learned or whatever, but we place an emphasis on education. Knowledge is like very important. Like and because one core tenet of Judaism is to question things, like, there's the, you know, the the Old Testament is not the end all be all Jewish book. There are so many Jewish books after that, one of which is like, so there's so there's like the oral law, which was like, second, third century, and then they decided to write down the oral law. And so with the writing of it down came the ability to add commentary. And then as that progressed and went on and on, there's this book called like the Talmud, which is like halacha, Jewish law. So it starts with, an excerpt from the oral law and then the written law, and it's surrounded by commentary. And it's not just like all the commentary from like all the rabbis at that day. Like the rabbis are like distanced by like sometimes by like 100 something years. And it's this always idea of like revisiting and questioning. And so that mindset, right? Like that idea that like, to always question and always like seek out like what's the right thing, right? Or never be satisfied with like just the answer you have, because time adapts, everything adapts. So like, a case in point in Judaism is, on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to make a fire, right? That's what it says in the Bible, right? Because that's considered work, making a fire. All right, what about electricity? Right? There was no electricity back then. So like, how did we get from there to there? And then it was like, all right, well now, back in the day, all the Jews lived in the same community and they would walk to synagogue. But like, my synagogue growing up was a 15-minute drive. Am I allowed to drive to synagogue because I'm making a fire in the engine? And so,
Right.
Jews reinterpreted it. It's like, well, if this is the intent and blah, blah, blah. And remember, you can't just all of a sudden decide that, yeah, you can do that, no problem. You have to find precedent, right? And so it's like going back and poring over the books and being okay, like we got to find a precedent, we got to find a way to make it okay, but adapt it to the time we're living in. And so, as far as like Jews being successful, educationally or you know within society, I just think like part of it has to do with just with that mindset of like there's always a pathway forward, right? Like there's always an answer. A problem is just something that is just a solution that hasn't been found yet. And so
Yeah.
I think that that's just partially has to do with like the people of the book, but also has to do with the fact that like throughout time, like the Jews have been persecuted. Like there hasn't been more than like 150 200 year period since the beginning where like a group of people hasn't tried to like kill off the Jews or exile the Jews or like blame them for something. And when the Jews had the ancient temple, and all of a sudden they get taken over and exiled to like Babylonia, it's like, all right, do we stop being Jewish or do we just like figure out how to be Jewish in Babylonia now? And how do we adapt that? Do we assimilate into society? Because that might make it easier for us, but still hold on to our roots. Like, how do we figure that out? And so a lot of Judaism, you know, a lot of Judaism is adversity, right? In the history of things. So
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. And uh, when it comes to that adversity, you know, I have my thoughts as far as why we see it like in modern times and even like pre modern times. But before I give my POV, I'm curious of what your thoughts are in regards to why that is.
why why there is adversity against Jews, or
Yeah, like why do you think that there consistently throughout time has been moments where the Jews have faced adversity and persecution?
yeah, I mean, so if we're talking about like anti-Semitism, like moving into that conversation, it's anti-Semitism or the history of anti-Semitism can be broken down into kind of like three sections, if you will. And I'm sure it gets much deeper than that, but I'm just going very high level. One is like ancient, right? Like, oh, like you have one God, my God's better than yours. Like, let's fight about it, and like, throughout time, being the other within like, another land and like that kind of space in ancient times, right? Before we get to like, I mean, that's kind of been resurfacing a bit up here, but for different reasons, but I'll get to that. And then, after, ancient anti-Semitism, it's this idea of religious anti-Semitism, right? Like Jews killed Jesus, not good. We can't like them for that. That
Yep,
was that was a bad move on their part.
you guys killed them.
Yeah. And so that between that like idea, but not, remember, that's just between Christianity. Like in Islam there was also like types of anti-Semitism that existed. Um, but it also comes down to this idea of like a rival monotheistic faith, right? Like the Jews don't accept like the new word of God, same God but new word, but and the Jews don't accept them, so there'll be punished for that. And like in you know medieval Europe, Christianity was like the blood libel, like Jews murdering Christian children for like ritual for their to make their matzah, which is like so ridiculous. But
Wait, could you say that again?
the blood libel, yeah, it's this idea of a blood libel where like Christian children would go missing, and the community would say, oh, like the Jews killed this child and to take his blood to make matzah.
Wow.
Yeah. And like, but like, also look at it from a political power dynamic standpoint. It's like, it's easy. Like the Jews are always usually, they're never the dominant group, right? They haven't been before the state of Israel came around like 50, 60 years ago, they were never the dominant group in like anywhere, population wise. And so, it was easy to like blame like the small group in the corner that's like just minding its own business, at their own lunch table. um, you know and in like medieval in medieval Muslim countries, it was not so much it wasn't like anti-Semitism like blood libel stuff. It was more like Jews were just second class citizens and they had their own rules and weren't afforded the same opportunities. But in all honesty, being like living in medieval times, I think I would much rather live in like an Islamic country versus a Christian Europe, because like you still had rights in like an Islamic country. They were just not as good as like as if you were Muslim. But like you still had
Right.
rights and there were rules and there was like, yeah, there's things you couldn't do, but like you didn't necessarily have to worry about like the government blaming you for something and then killing you.
Right. I feel like, especially when it comes to like the early on like days of Christianity, I feel like it was one of those things where I think that the like once people in power realized how potent Christianity was and how it was just a really really great means of just instilling fear and power and like being able to build empires and everything. I just feel like they just got drunk with it, and it just created this mechanism where like they just they were jizzing their pants with all of the things that they could get away with because of it. And I think that because of that, they're like that just inherently created an environment where it's like Christianity or nothing else. And we had, there were like those crazy wars with the Muslims and everything that killed more people than any like modern war. Like when you look at the amount of people that died for the sake of God, which if you think like if you look at it on the surface is just ridiculous. But I think that when I look at modern times, especially, I feel like when you look at uh, the Jewish population, I feel like there's two things that come to mind. First thing is that um, they like while they were the minority in a lot of areas, because of that perseverance, because of what we were talking about earlier, they were in good standing, like economically within the like not all, but like in certain spots within the societies that they were living in. And I think that at the end of the day, when things are going well collectively, we're all willing to work with people who are different from us, who have different beliefs, who have different values. But I think when things are not going well, when when something catastrophic occurs, that's when we start to look at someone who doesn't identify with the belief systems that we have, who doesn't look like us. We start to pit them, like we start to point them out and make them out to be the villains or the bad guys because there's a limited amount of resources, and there's always going to, like in situations like that, you just look at any point in time, there's always going to be this nut job who's going to come to power, who's going to call out like what's like a legitimate thing that's happening that's impacting people, and then pitting those people against a certain other group to like, because nothing's more potent than fear. And I feel like that's kind of what's kind of becoming more prominent right now. Like you hear about things like Jewish space lasers. What the fuck does that even mean? What on earth? And it's like you hear these things and people legitimately believe it. And you like you hear about like because and I just find it mind-boggling. It's like there's all these billionaires. You have Jeff Bezos, you have Bill Gates. All these guys are like super rich, but then like they choose the one billionaire who's Jewish. I forget his name.
George Soros.
Yeah, George Soros, and it's like he's the one in control of everything, and it's all him. Like you see these riots and Black Lives Matter, like oh he's paying them, like he's trying to control everything, like and then like you get into the whole notion of like dehumanizing people, like you were saying with the matzah made out of the children and everything, like what do you think it is about the human psyche where we're able to even manifest this kookaloo, loony, batshit, crazy nonsense, and people buy it?
Yeah, well, so there were two more types of anti-Semitism that this is like the perfect segue for that. One is racial anti-Semitism, which came around in like, the 18th, 19th century, which is basically this idea like as Darwinism, right? And like modern science, biology, taxonomy, like assigning, ordering the species between like higher and lower life forms. Like when those ideas was coming out, it was like, okay, well, we can do the same thing to human beings, right? Jews are rats, they're reptiles, they're dogs, they're lower life forms, you know what I mean? And so, that came about as the idea of making Jews, um, and not just Jews, like any group, another group didn't like, subhuman.
Right.
And as that went on, I think as far as like modern anti-Semitism and kind of the culmination, all three of those previous ones, was this piece of propaganda that was written in like, debatable late 1800s, early 19 like 1901, 1902, and it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No.
Oh, so this is basically the this is the map of like where you get all these current ones, like the Jews are bankers, the Jews are running the media and all that stuff. So it was this piece of propaganda that the sources are still, they say it could be based on like Russian texts because, and not to get into like the weeds historically here, but like after, Poland was divided like the first time, not in World War II, but before that, Russia all of a sudden inherited like all these Jewish little shtetl groups. And so as Russian nationalism came to rise, it was like, oh, these groups are, how do we make sure we keep control of them and like, stay on top of them? So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and what it is, it's a fake document that purport to be the minutes for a meeting between Jewish leaders, the Elders of Zion, right? And so in the minutes, it's all about how they're going to conspire to take over the world, right? And so, and this is totally fake, but it's like, and it a lot of it has to do with like old anti-Semitic canards, that basically like, okay, like Jewish bankers, like how are you gonna like make sure like we can control the banks, and like Jews and media, like this is how we're gonna make sure that Jews and media can like take control of the media, and like and ultimately like this is how we're gonna like control, everyone and like destroy society, right? And this was a booklet that was like minutes, like it was as if it was a meeting that happened and it was written like minutes, and that was published in the early 1900s. Now the kicker is that's in Europe. How did that make it to America? Henry Ford, the notorious anti-Semite, the Ford Motors Henry Ford, you know,
Yeah.
he paid for the printing of 500,000 copies to be distributed in the United States in like the 1920s, right? So that's how that made it here. Like those Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and like that is like when you look at like anti-Semitism today, you know, the Great Replacement theory, like Jews, like in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. That it comes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, like right out of the pages, and like this idea that like the Jews are trying to subvert, society, or white society, what have you, and they're controlling all the minorities behind the scenes to replace white people and ultimately like destroy society. And that's where a lot of that in like the bankers and like and the controlling the media and all that kind of stuff comes from. But like that has like serious real world consequences, like in 2018 with the shooting, um in Pittsburgh of the Pittsburgh synagogue. That day in synagogue was no accident. That synagogue was part of a national group of synagogues that were doing a HAIS Shabbat, HAIS, which is the Hebrew, HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So back in the day, it was about helping Jewish immigrants immigrate to, the United States from Russia, facing persecution elsewhere. And after World War II, when like they didn't really need that help anymore, or it kind of adapted into, just helping immigrants in general, right? So that guy chose that synagogue on that particular Shabbat because like that was like the theme of that Shabbat. So like, this idea of like bringing in immigrants, subverting like society and like trying to take down the white race or whatever. And so, it's crazy when you think about it, because like it's like that's like such a random thing for the Jews who have historically stick to themselves all of a sudden want to control everything from behind the scenes. Like, like it's just
It's
a weird thing.
ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And it makes me think of like, so for instance, before, you know, before the United States got involved in World War II, and like when there were all these people who were, talking about, well, like some people, not that many people at the time, were talking about how like what was happening in Germany, and nobody believed it until there was this gentleman, I forget his name, who actually infiltrated the one of the camps and like took a photo, and like it ended up like being publicized, and then that's like when people like started to like actually acknowledge and realize that everything that was being said was true. Like when like you think of the fact that like people were so skeptical and like wanted to dismiss that, but then like all the like you're telling me of this book that's like being like flooded into the United States, and like apparently has like infiltrated and has continuously become prominent within our society, and people believe it. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of crazy that like people, the things that people will not believe, and then the things that people will believe. And like I'm just curious, like what are your thoughts in regards to, because like I feel like right now in the country and in the world, where we're in a moment where there's lots of division, there's lots of things that have very similar remnants to where we were, say like in like the 40s or so, in regards to people forgetting about the history of things that happened then, in regards to just the slippery slope of fascism and things like that. Like, do you think that we're kind of repeating history in a sense right now?
Um, I don't know if we're necessarily repeating history. I think it was surprising how quickly such a large part of our country was so willing to throw everything behind someone who had fascist tendencies, right? That like this idea of like, you know, he could do no wrong. Like whatever he was doing, it was the right thing for the. And it's just like, yeah, but like you got to question a little bit, right? Like if you believe everything someone says, you're not just like you're just not thinking hard enough, right? Like I consider myself fairly liberal. Like I vote Democrat or independent most of the time. But like I've never met a politician or any leader that I agree with 100% of the time.
Yeah, no,
Because if
impossible,
well,
impossible if you're thinking.
well, if I did, that would just mean that I'm not thinking, I'm not looking deep enough. Because no one, even your siblings, your parents, like your best friend, you guys don't agree on everything. So there's no way that um, you would just agree with every single thing somebody is saying and doing. And so when then it becomes like, okay, well, it's not so much about what he's saying and doing, it's the person himself, right? Like I will follow you, not what you believe, it's just you. And so that's like fascistic tendencies, and like that is like a little concerning. But I also think that like you have people that are going to try and like grapple with that, or not grapple with that, but like seize on that, and like they're not they're not Donald Trump, so they're not going to be able to pull it off, right? Like Donald,
Yeah.
you know, like Donald Trump could pull it off because. So I spent a really long time trying not to name him, but like we all knew. Everyone who's listening knows what I'm talking about. But like no one's gonna be able to pull it off because he is so unapologetic and like he's never wrong and like that's his brand though, right? Like that's who he is. Like he refuses to ever admit fault. It's always and he spent his entire life and career playing like pitching the blame on somebody else. So he's an expert at it. Then you have people like Ted Cruz who want to be the next, who want to seize on those people by like opposing the thing, opposing, you know, Biden's certification of election results. Meanwhile, Texas is freezing to death, and he sneaks off to Cancun, and like within like 30 minutes, he's apologizing. Nope, man. Like you're not gonna, you can't like the same people who love Donald Trump for not apologizing aren't gonna love you because you are apologizing now. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Like, I think, while I think you're probably right, I think the one argument I would make to that is, well, first and foremost, I think that what happens in the next year or two economically and like, the recovery and like how the government decides to like either help or not really help people will really determine the sentiment of the nation and like how we can proceed. But I think we should really err on the side of caution because I think if they don't put through like big and bold recovery plan and really show the American people that they have their back and that they're willing to like support them, I think that we could end up with someone worse. I think that we could end up with someone because at the end of the day, like one of the things that frustrates me, like in hindsight, I think that we like while Trump was very influential, he was someone who was able to really galvanize the troops. He was unapologetic, all these other things, but also he was very sloppy. He like we can call him like a quote unquote fascist, but like he wasn't really a fascist like to the full extent where he actually was able to like be clever and tactical and really put through legislation and do things that would be malicious to the nation. He was lazy. He didn't want to do anything. Like he's like a half-assed fascist, if
Well,
anything. So I think that we just need to be careful because I think that if we don't learn from our mistakes, I think we could end up with a real fascist and things can get really bad.
Well, what I will say to that is like, you know, like I said at the beginning, like my grandparents on my dad's side survived the Holocaust. My dad has a go back. I will probably have a go back. Just because like historically, when things go bad, shortly after that they go bad for the Jews and it's time to go. You know? And so and so you know, it's just one of those things where it's like um as because you know, and also in Judaism, like one of the few groups who get it both from the far right and far left. You know, it's if it's the far right, replacement theories of Jews should you know are trying to subvert society, blah blah blah, or if it's the far right, also kind of also with like the Jews controlling the money in some senses, but also like you know Israel has become a vehicle for anti-Semitism, and that's not to say that there isn't legitimate criticism of Israel. There absolutely is, but on the far left, um, use it as a way to just be anti-Semitic, and it's sometimes thinly veiled, sometimes not veiled at all, you know. And so I can't. I mean, I would love to be proven wrong. I really can't find a group of people who have it bad on the fringes on both sides. And what's scary today is that the fringes on both sides seem to be becoming more mainstream. And so now what happens in like you said too, I'm thinking maybe 10 years where like you know the Republican Party still wanting to, you know, keep these fervent Trump supporters. Because say what you will about the 2020 election, the most people voted ever, right? So
Yeah.
for the Republican Party, they're like, well, we need those votes because that just means people weren't voting before. So we to you know I'll never say it out loud, but like we might not like Trump, but like he really gets people to go out and vote. So like we kind of have to like subscribe to what he was saying because that'll get more votes and we'll have control of the government and blah 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 blah. Where on like you know on the right side, like being a liberal Jew is well and good until you get to the topic of Israel, and then it becomes like a very slippery slope, and you know you get you know this idea of like intersectionality where like everyone's struggle is everybody else's struggle, and it's like as a liberal Jew like you believe that, but then you're also told like no, like you are part of the problem now because you're perpetuating you know persecution against the Palestinian people. and because you support Israel, right? And so that also kind of like is like, wait, what? Like, but like I'm on your side, but I'm not on your side. You know, like you don't want me, but I stand for so many different things that we agree upon, and this one issue, it's a wedge issue, and and it becomes difficult. And so as these groups become more mainstream, and like it's just gonna be interesting to see where politically and also just like within society will Jews be scapegoated again no matter who's in charge, which is going to be scary. And like a lot of people are one issue voters, and I don't mean to like turn this into like Jews and politics and stuff, but for a lot of Jews, the one issue is Israel, which is why you do have people who vote Republican because of like the undeniable support for Israel. And that's also why you have older Democrats within Congress that are also like, no, like we're pro-Israel. But that's because they want to hold on to their like the Jewish constituency, because a lot of them do vote on just the issue of Israel. I do not vote on just the issue of Israel. I, as someone who has been to Israel several times, will be the first to be critical of Israel and their treatment of Palestinians. And like something does have to be done, because I don't think the status quo is tenable. It's untenable.
Right.
Um, that being said, it is a very complicated issue that people have spent the last 30, 40 years trying to solve, and it's like, who knows? And say what you will about Trump and Kushner and all that, but in the last like year or two of the Trump presidency, Israel normalized relations with like 4 or 5 Arab nations, and like no one saw that coming. And it probably came on the heels of America being like, we'll cut you a check, or you can buy all the weapons you want, because you guys don't like Iran, we don't like Iran, Israel doesn't like Iran, but yeah, it's sometimes difficult being reconciling like um, being Jewish and politics, because it's just
No, yeah. And I think to your point, like the last thing you said, Donald Trump is a schmuck, but like it's just it's crazy that we've gotten to the point where like even if he does something good, people won't even want to like acknowledge like, okay, yeah, he's an asshole, he's terrible, but like it's like we've just gotten to that point. And then also I think, Israel, that's a topic I'm not even gonna really touch. The only
no,
thing
that's a
I'm
whole nother topic, bro.
Yeah, like the
You're gonna
only
have
thing I
to,
will
yeah.
say, I think that in general, and I'm not even just like calling out Israel, like just around the world, I think that there just need like if we were more in the mindset of separation of church and state, synagogue and state, religion and state, whatever, however you want to like phrase it, we'd be better off. But
Yeah.
it is what it is. Um, what are your thoughts on Christianity? Because I know in our conversations you said something, and like I can lead you up if you don't really remember what you said to me, but like we were having a conversation, and I was asking your thoughts in regards to why it is that Christianity was able to really become the most influential just perspective and just dominate the world the way that it has. Like I know like there was a comedian who did this joke where he was like, the Christians won. He's like, the Christians won. He's like, I can prove to you that they won. What year is it? He's like,
Yeah.
after who died? He's like, and anywhere in the world you go. He's like the Chinese. He's like they have their new year, but they're not going off of that calendar when it comes to paying the bills and everything. He's like, so the Christians won. And it's true. What about Christianity do you think was just so sexy that it just consumed the world?
So sexy. Um, well, um, I think what it is that in Judaism, or in just most faiths, like you can't create an image of God, right? Like that's not allowed. So God is like this abstract thing, right? It's like it's an idea. Jesus very much put a face to the name. It's like now there's a figurehead. In Judaism, there really is no figurehead, or like in Christianity, the Pope is a figurehead, and there's all these people you can turn to and being like that guy or that person, or like these saints, throughout, like oh, this person they're like the epitome of what it means, and like they're the saint of this or the patron saint of that. I'm not very up to date on the saints. I'm sorry, but it started to it basically became easier to identify with an actual human being than an abstract idea. And I think that very much helped um, it spread, because now you have stories of a guy who was going around and doing all these great miracles, and not this like, oh, this thing happened and it was the hand of God that did this thing, like, which is like, okay, maybe, but like, I don't know, that sounds very abstract, versus like, Jesus walked on water. Jesus went to a party, they were out of wine, and he turned the water into wine, like, like all that kind of. I know that's not what happened,
Wasn't
but
a
like,
part. I don't think it was a
no,
party.
it wasn't a party, but like, what a party trick. Um, but like, I think part of the reason is that it put like a face to the religion, like someone people can turn to and be like, that's our guy right there.
That's a good answer. You said something else differently though than we spoke that I'm gonna say, and I think
Okay.
that actually what because I'm actually happy that you mentioned what you did because I think that that's a good addition. But like one of the things that you said that like really stuck in my head was that there wasn't at the time when Jesus was around, there wasn't really a message that was put forth towards people who were poor, who were
Mm,
in very, unideal situations, saying like, hey, God's got your back, like you will be blessed. And that was very potent and that was very um it was very attractive to those people because before there was more of a priority put forth onto the people who were already in a prosperous situation and like the people who had more of the means of control of messaging, and then you have this dude telling all these people who probably outnumbered the people who were like well off, and like you're giving them all this hope that they never had, and that hope was infectious. And I feel like
yes.
like you said, like during our conversation, I think that because of that hope being so infectious, it like not only became attractive to the people that he was speaking to, but it became attractive to the people in power because they saw how influential it was and how impactful it was, and they're like, wow, like this is some sexy shit. I need to get on this. Like it was like GameStop stock or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah. Jesus bets. Slash slash r slash Jesus bets. Yeah, no. So yes, he was one of the first person going out and being like, it's like being poor is pious, right? And you'll don't worry, like when you'll get yours in the end, like God will reward you, and like this idea that like like you're suffering now, but there will be reward in like, you know, the afterlife. And like, yes, that was like, if you're a poor farmer and you're busting ass every day and like your life sucks, and like, the ruling class is just like getting away with whatever, this idea that there's, oh wait, God actually cares, like, I'm living a godly life, like that kind of resonates with people. And like with people in power, they're like, awesome, these people love being poor because they think God is like all about it. So, and like ultimately what we're talking about is perversions of Christianity, not actual Christianity.
Right, right, right.
It's like, I just want to clear that up because, I think religion, you know, what is it? Opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one, but no one wants to see yours, or something like that.
Yeah.
I think the same thing goes with like religion. Like everyone has their own belief system and their own belief system and structure, but like no one like, I don't want to know about yours. Like I'm good, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it made being poor was a good thing almost, and that was like, gave a lot of people hope, but also like you talked about, gave the ruling class a way to control the population.
Yeah. And I think that like, taking the religious cap off for a second, I think
Hmm.
that, in general, regardless of what religion you're speaking of, I think that in general, I don't want to generalize, but I think in general, every religion has a bit of a balance of positive and negative, hope, and a bit of doom and gloom. And I think if I'm just like putting like what I believe and everything like to the side, I like when you look at that, like what we're talking about right now, and just like the the thought and the concept of going to like having this idea for the poor person, the person who has no hope, that there is this possibility that once they die they're going to go to this amazing paradise, and that things are going to be great. Like if we're thinking about it and we're thinking, okay, more likely than not, it's probably the shoal, and like the shoal is it. and like you're dead and like you're in a deep sleep and like you basically just cease to exist and that's it. Like let's just hypothesize that that's really what happens. Like you're just dead. You're done. You're gone. You cease to exist. That's it. You're basically asleep forever. Okay. So if we establish that, if we all agree on that, and then you think, okay, well, there's all these people who are in predicaments that there's no way, shape, or form is going to get better. Like Timmy is going to be working like in the fucking factory, making coal until he dies out at 13, and that's just a fact. And it's like you think about like these people, you think about, and like it's any religion, not even just Christianity, you think about these people who are in situations where there is no hope, there is no possibility whatsoever for them to get out of whatever adversity is that they have. It's almost kind of poetic and beautiful to at least give them that sense of hope, give them that illusion, or you can call it illusion, whatever you want to call it, that there is this great thing that's to come, and that almost makes it so that even though their life, like without it, would have had no meaning, now it kind of has something because now they have something to look forward to. Kind of like, I don't know, like if like you have to put down your dog and it's like you give them these treats and you give them all these things and get them excited and make them have like all these endorphins and happiness and everything, and then boom, they're gone. But at least like in the process of that happening, and even though like it ended up being a bit grim, there was some happiness and positivity prior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's just, it comes back to this idea that like, not everyone's life is great. And sometimes people need to like know that there's something more to this, right? When your life's not great. But I think what's interesting about Judaism is that part of Judaism is this idea that like humans have the ability to change the world and they have a responsibility to do so, right? So it's like it's not enough to just be um, like if someone's suffering, like you have to try and alleviate their suffering. There's this idea called tikkun olam, to repair the world, and you're not obligated to fix the whole world, but you are obligated to like try, and you can't ignore it, right? And that's why like when it comes to either like social reform or social justice or just the idea of justice in general, it's just like you can't, if you're sitting on the sidelines just letting people suffering and doing wrong, like it's not allowed. And then also goes for your own life, right? Like it's not just like doing for others, but like what responsibility do you have for yourself to like improve your own situation in any way you can? And like going back to Judaism being like a lifestyle religion just offers you abilities to do that. Like we talk, like right now, what's the biggest trend in like mental health? Mindfulness, and like being very mindful and thankful for like the things that are going right in your life. In Judaism, there are blessings for everything. You're supposed to say a blessing when you see a rainbow. You're supposed to say a blessing when, I mean, for every meal, you're supposed to say a blessing on the bread and the wine, or vegetable, like whatever you eat. You're supposed to say blessings on, every time for certain holidays, we say a blessing on the first night of the holiday, thanking God for allowing us to reach this point in the year again. And like, you know, it's like that's mindfulness, right? That's just like acknowledging that, like, oh, like, wow, a rainbow, like, what a beautiful thing. Like, I'm going to say this little blessing. And it's just me acknowledging that, like, I'm so lucky to see this rainbow, or like, thank God for letting me see this rainbow, or whatever. And so, um, I don't know. I mean, I know there are I don't really know very little about the prayers in both Islam and Christianity. I know Muslims pray 5 times a day, and I know Christians go to church on Sunday before football, and and but like I don't know if those other religions have like all these like little blessings that you're supposed to say um, for like any random thing that happens in your life, and like
Well, in Islam, probably, yeah, but I think in Christianity, like I think depending on like your level of seriousness and like how in the weeds you are, it probably varies. But yeah, I agree. And I think that one thing that like is difficult, but like I think so, like for instance, I've done, and we're gonna have another episode on Hinduism, and one of the things that we talk about, like when I talk to my Hindu buddy, is just the philosophies of Hinduism in regards to like how everything in the world that you see is basically the Maya, is an illusion, and basically the whole purpose of life is to basically distinguish what is real, and like being more in touch with yourself, and like understanding like deep down who you truly are and how we're all connected and everything. And I think, you know, in this world and all the distractions or illusions that we have around us, I think that sometimes what gets lost is the fact that the fact that we even exist is an absolute miracle. And I think that it's hard, like I get it, because sometimes I even, like will have days where I'm like unappreciative and just a stupid schmuck. But like I try to at least like 2 or 3 times in the week pull myself back and like acknowledge that the fact that we even exist is an absolute blessing, is incredible, is miraculous. We're on a freaking spinning rock, have no idea how the fuck this is going on, no idea what the fuck anything is. Like the fact that you even exist is a mere miracle and is something to be grateful for.
Yeah, even beyond the fact that like humans exist on the spinning rock, the mere fact that like your own consciousness, like what, like we're still trying to figure out what even is that, like the idea that like I wake up every day, and like in Judaism there's a prayer you say like right when you wake up. It's like thank you for like basically returning the soul to my body, you know
Right.
and so it's like it's these small things where like you know it this is just like a thought that popped in my head, but like right now with modern society, like everything's kind of all over the place and people are super stressed out, especially the pandemic, and like just like stress from work and stress from just like existing. And like there's also like for a lot of people wholesale rejection of religion with you know i'm not saying I'm not saying without reason, right? Because certain parts of every religion have gotten a bad rap for not being super inclusive or being veiled bigotry and stuff like that. um, but if you can look beyond that and find the parts that individuals will connect with, I personally think religion can do a lot for mental health, because there are all these things about being mindful and like even prayer, that like prayer and meditation are like the same, two sides of the same coin, you know and so it would be interesting to see that. And even in Judaism, you're seeing that now, is that you're seeing certain things coming about that aren't necessarily God centric parts of Judaism, which is like, wait, religion with no God, like how can that be? How can that be? And it's like, well, it's not that there is no God. It's just like God might not be the end all be all about it all. That might God might not. It might be besides the point. Besides God, besides the point of God, there's all this other stuff, right? And so maybe the next movement for either Christianity, Islam, Hindu, Judaism, whatever it is that it's like looking at religion without the lens of God and seeing like what parts can you apply to your everyday life that just make you feel like a better person.
Oh no, absolutely. And one thing that we spoke about on my very first podcast, which is really interesting, we were talking about how we're in a point in time in our world where, you know, atheism, agnosticism is at like an all-time high. Like it's just going up and up. And it was interesting. The My friend, his thoughts on it was that basically you have a lot of people who are seeking, basically like where they would have seeked meaning, purpose, community, from a faith standpoint, they're seeking all of that out now through their job, through their their careers and things like that. And like that's a lot to put on just on like your career and everything, to like because like with religion, that's something that kind of stretches out and kind of alleviates the whole yearning for purpose, for meaning, for community. It's like an employer can't offer you all of those things and pay you. Like it's like that's a lot to ask of your employer. So
Yeah,
I find that interesting.
yeah. I totally agree with you there. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and I think part of the reason why atheism is so high, or just like their like religion is just not as popular, is because when you talk about God and when you talk about what happens when you die and what's the right thing. Um, it kind of sounds like an all or nothing approach, right? Like, how can we talk about God and but I don't agree with all these other things, but like if God is this all seeing, all knowing being, then like how can I like not go how can I not be all in? And I think that's one of the big um things about religion or what needs not what needs to change, what is changing is that it's like, okay, like let's cut some of this stuff off the sides and like let's just go back to the basics and like what resonates with you and instead of looking more of religion as like, oh, like I need this otherwise I'm not going to get into heaven, it can be like, okay, well, like what about this resonates within my life and what feels good about this in like living my life and like how can I do that, like for example, one of the first dates I did with my current girlfriend is we went to go give blood and like, yeah, right, super sexy needles. um but I explained to her, I was like, the reason why I like to give blood is because there was a rabbi, Rambam, who basically established these 8 levels of charity, and the highest level of charity is when you give to somebody and you don't know who it's going to, and the person receiving it doesn't know where it's coming from. So you as the giver don't get to feel pride over someone, and the person who's receiving it doesn't get to feel shame if they see you out in the street like, oh, like, oh, there's Julian, like he gave me like 30 bucks because like I couldn't pay for food and like I feel shame, you know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
it's like, but like giving blood is like one of those things. And so like those values, those like Jewish values, are certain things that like those are the things in Judaism that's how I try to live my life. Not necessarily like the God question and all that stuff, or like what happens to us after we die. It's more like, okay, well, how can I live my life in a way that makes me feel good? And like, I find a lot of that in Judaism, probably because I went to Jewish day school learning it. But even some of the things I learned growing up, I still question it. Like, I always question it. Like, my thoughts on a lot of things have evolved just because I had just more life experience from like being in 8th grade or like high school. So,
Nice. And so what would you say is the like your fondest memory and correspondence to your religion?
so it was when I was in Israel and I was actually on a class trip to Israel. And because I went to Jewish day school, so I think 8th grade and also senior high school, you went to Israel. And I think it was the 8th grade trip to Israel. Um, I was looking for a pair of tefillin, which is like the leather straps that you wrap around your arm and with like a little leather, it's like a leather box with a prayer in it that sits on your bicep, and another one that like sits in between your eyes on your head. Um, and within the leather box is this little prayer. It's like a rite of passage, like after your bar mitzvah, like you wear these when you say like the morning services during the week, like it's just a reminder. And I borrowed one of my friends, and when you wrap it, there's kind of like the markings on your arms of like where the leather straps were. And so I went with one of my teachers to a very religious part of Jerusalem, and I'm in the store and I'm looking around and I'm like, hey, like I'm looking for a pair to fill in. Like I would like to buy a pair. And they're not cheap. So like my parents had sent me to Israel with money specifically to buy tefillin. And there was like this older Orthodox Jewish guy who just looks at me and he says, Achi, and he points to his arm, and Achi means brother. Because I was wearing a Storchy Surfs shirt. So you saw like the markings on my arm, and he like rolled up his sleeve and showed me his markings. So like this old Jewish man who I've never met before, who is probably way more religious, observant, like following the book more than like I do. But like we both did this one thing this morning. We both did the same thing this morning as we wrapped to fill in. And for me, that like kind of put it in perspective is like, okay, like I definitely don't believe all the stuff this guy believes, but we're both like, he views me as his brother, a total stranger. And now I'm thinking about a child, which was also a little weird when I say it out loud, but like still, it was for me like a huge moment because it's like, yeah, like don't have to agree or believe all the same things, but like we're brothers. And like for me in Judaism, that was really important at that time because at the time I was also, you know, didn't really know many non-Jews. But now as an adult, I look back in that moment and it's like, okay, like this total stranger viewed me as his brother. Like that's beyond Judaism. That's just everyone. Like everyone is like my brother because guess what? We all have to go through the same trials and tribulations every day. Um, some of us harder than others, but all of us still have to do it, you know? And so for Judaism, it was like a really important moment for me. But partially because it kind of transcended Judaism, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, that's beautiful, and that kind of made me think like it almost feels as if Judaism, like the thing that ties Judaism and Islam together, I think, is that both of them, it's like a like you're saying like a kinship in regards to the people within the faith, a bit more than in Christianity. I feel like there's a bit more, sectioning in Christianity, but like I feel like I don't know if you have you ever seen the movie Malcolm X with Denzel Washington?
No, I have not.
Oh man, you got to watch it. That's a really good movie.
I'll add it to
But
the list.
but like towards the end, Malcolm X goes to the Mecca, and like one of the things that he says, and like I think this is in his biography as well. Like he was saying how it was just the like a life changing experience for him because it was just like a bunch of men from all walks of life, except like acknowledging that all of them are brothers, and like it was just like all around the world, like you see like all different shades and colors. And I think that's when like he kind of started to, because when he first started he was just like fuck the white people, like we need to, and then like once he saw that he's like, yeah, he's like, nah, like that's not what I believe. And he started to shift his perception. But
Yeah.
that definitely came to mind when we were speaking. Drive us home, Ari Weinberger, and tell like tell someone who might be listening right now who either has no faith or who's you know struggling with their faith, and like as far as just looking at the world and all the BS that they're seeing right now, and they're just like, really, is there an omnipotent being like that's really observing and intervening like with all of this BS? And do they even, and if they are there, do they even give a crap about us, about me or anything?
Um, if you're out there listening and you're wondering if there is or isn't a God, my question to you is, does it matter? Will that really change the way you act? If you found out tomorrow that oh my God, there is a God, and so you're gonna rush to go to services and like pray, are you gonna start doing that every day? If not, then like just keep doing what you're doing. Like your faith is a struggle, right? Like that's why they call it's a leap of faith, you know? What I would say to someone who's struggling is find the parts that resonate with you. Not everything's going to. It's very difficult for every single thing to do that, but like you can find the parts that make sense to you, or find the person who interprets those things in a way that makes you go, "Oh, okay." And like that's the beauty of religion. Like you don't have to follow every single thing to a T. You follow the things that make sense, and you know, God or not doesn't matter. Like I don't keep doing what I'm doing because I'm worried about what God's gonna think. I do it because it makes me feel good doing certain things. And the things I don't like doing, guess what? I don't do them. So, you know what I mean? So like, but I find value in doing the things I enjoy doing. And I find value, the value is just the way it makes me feel. When things is not the easy thing, but I know it's the right thing. And the reason I know it's the right thing is because I read with a rabbi said like that's probably what you should be doing, and that just clicked with me. Then like, yeah, and guess what? If I read it and he was like, that's just what you got to do. And I was like, I don't think that's true. I wouldn't do it. But I
do,
found that.
do
So,
you eat bacon cheeseburgers?
yeah, they're so good. I would put lobster on it if that was something they served. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, here's the thing bacon's really good. And so is shrimp. But that's the thing. Like, keeping kosher for me isn't how I show that like my faith or like how I'm Jewish, because that doesn't resonate with me. Not eating a bacon cheeseburger because literally in the Bible it says God said don't eat that. It's like, all right, then God, don't eat it. But I'm gonna eat it because it's really good.
Yeah, I think Chris Rock has a joke about that where he's like, yeah, he's like, why the Jews and Muslims back in the day said don't eat any swine? He's like, because it could have killed you then.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and it's just, it's just one of those things that like I derive a lot of joy from food and like trying different foods and eat, kosher, not kosher. And like if I get joy out of it, like is it really that bad? And like is God really gonna be that mad at like it is God like that vindictive that he'd be that mad at me for eating a bacon cheeseburger? Probably not. It's more of, it's more of a way in Judaism to like show your faith. Like abstain from eating these foods as showing like your commitment to God. And it's like, well, I am committed to God just in different ways.
Right. Ari Weinberger, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a pleasure. It was well worth the wait.
Thank you, Julian. This was awesome. And anytime you want to talk about more questions, if you ever want to dive into other topics that I can make myself an expert on, I'd be happy to. For sure.
Absolutely.